7 months ago, the Minnesota Timberwolves were in the Western Conference Finals, experiencing their best season in 2 decades and had a genuine shot at the NBA title. They boasted size, skill, defense, and a stellar young guard in Anthony Edwards. Now, however, their team is unraveling. We know what transpired between then and now. They traded away their second-best player, who is now excelling with his new squad, in exchange for financial flexibility and a draft pick. The team that was left behind is utterly directionless, and at the center of this turmoil is the franchise's most crucial player not named Kevin Garnett, Anthony Edwards. A significant factor in the Timberwolves' decision to trade Karl Anthony Towns was their desire for more future flexibility and to build a sustainable contender around Edwards. Despite last season's success, they believed that moving Towns was the optimal strategy. However, during this time, it's evident that Anthony Edwards is unhappy with the current situation in Minnesota. This isn't necessarily the worst-case scenario for the Timberwolves, as Edwards is under contract until 2029. If you clicked on this video thinking he would request a trade or that the Timberwolves would need to trade him soon, that seems highly unlikely. At just 23 or 24 years old, and on his first extension after his rookie deal, Minnesota has him secured long-term, which likely contributed to their confidence in making the Towns trade initially. However, that doesn't change the reality that they need to resolve this situation. It is incredibly mentally exhausting for a star player to believe they were on the rise. They were experiencing their moment, making the conference finals, and while they lost in 5 games, the initial 3 games of that series were exceptionally close, losing by just 3-2 and endpoints. Minnesota could have been in the NBA Finals just 7 months ago, and now Anthony Edwards is part of a mediocre Western Conference team. This situation weighs heavily on a player who sees themselves moving toward being one of the top players in the league. He has voiced this frustration, stating he doesn't want to be just a facilitator, he wants to be the primary scorer at this stage in his career. After expressing that, he went out and scored over 50 points, yet still lost by double digits to Detroit, who was playing the second game of a back-to-back and missing key players like Jaden Ivey. Although this doesn't fit the typical narrative of Anthony Edwards wanting out of Minnesota and the team losing their star, it is incredibly challenging to intentionally shift from the Western Conference Finals to being a super team, which I don't believe was Minnesota's goal. The aim of the deal was indeed to create financial flexibility by acquiring a future first-round pick to bring in Dante DiVincenzo, whom they believed would be a suitable addition to their team. They likely intended to let Randall leave, freeing up cap space, and then advance from there. However, it's clear they expected the team to be as competitive as last year's squad, anticipating they could swap Cat for Randall and DiVincenzo, leveraging the pick to maintain that level, rather than experiencing the current challenges of this season. Looking back, that belief seems misguided since Randall's fit, even in New York, was not optimal. He requires significant ball time, struggles to space the floor when off the ball, and often dominates the dribble. Although Dante DiVincenzo had an excellent previous season, it was essentially his sole standout year in the NBA, and they soon moved him from that supportive setup to the Timberwolves, impacting his long-term prospects. One could argue that it remains a wise decision for Minnesota to seek that flexibility since many believe, though I am not among them, that Minnesota was not that strong last year, that they were far from reaching the finals or securing the championship, and that the Dallas series was never competitive. Moreover, they contend that Rudy Gobert has created significant problems for them in the playoffs, thus justifying the trade. However, whether you agree or not, it's apparent this has turned into a disastrous situation for Minnesota. A frequent argument you'll encounter is that this predicament isn't Minnesota's doing. It's attributed to the new CBA, the second apron, and the recent agreement imposed by the league that restricts roster flexibility. Yet, this is not entirely accurate. The CBA indeed complicates maintaining an extremely costly roster compared to previous years, which was its original intent to allow owners to save money and ostensibly distribute talent more equitably across the league. Nevertheless, teams like Boston can still manage to maintain highly expensive rosters without issue, having players such as Drew Holiday, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and Kristaps Porzingis on substantial contracts, showcasing that there's nothing in the CBA mandating that Karl Anthony Towns must be traded for less than his worth. To stay beneath a certain imaginary number, they could have retained all their players, which was feasible. This is what the CBA imposed on Minnesota when the second apron rule came into effect. For a team like the Timberwolves, with players like Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, and Karl Anthony Towns, they were on track for a payroll resembling the Celtics in the upcoming years, had they kept Towns and avoided the trade. In that case, the CBA dictates that your current team, akin to what Boston has, would be your roster for the next 3 to 4 years if you aim to compete for a championship. You won't have the luxury of adding another star mid-season, nor will you be able to acquire someone like Kyle Kuzma at the deadline. The restrictions on trading possibilities, the financial return you can secure, and future moves involving players like Rudy Gobert or Karl Anthony Towns become very limiting. Once you finalize that roster, options for making changes are severely constrained. Last offseason represented a crucial turning point for Minnesota as the CBA restricted their roster choices post their playoff run with Anthony Edwards. They enjoyed playing, with the spacing of Karl Anthony Towns and the defense of Rudy Gobert, but ultimately decided that the team wasn't strong enough to contend for titles in the upcoming years, which justified the financial commitment and limited roster flexibility. This is what the front office decided, and regardless of whether you believe Minnesota could have maintained their team and remained competitive, I definitely think they could have. At times, they were the best defensive team we've seen in recent playoff history. Last postseason, there was a moment when it seemed they were on track to be favorites in the Western Conference. Playoff outcomes often hinge on matchups, and unfortunately, they didn't match up well against Dallas. Whether or not you see them as long-term contenders is beside the point. What matters now is the predicament Minnesota is in and the path they intentionally chose. They made this decision fully aware that the current season's outcome was a distinct possibility, and they may risk alienating Anthony Edwards. This doesn't imply that he will be traded this year or the next, but consider the situation with Jimmy Butler. While Butler's temperament is known, his discontent in Miami is partly due to the long-term contract situation, coupled with his belief that they would acquire Bradley Beal. He believed they would eventually acquire Damian Lillard and hoped to get some additional support, perhaps another star to share the scoring load with him, and really elevate the team. He didn't expect Tyler Herro to still be part of the roster, nor did he think Bamba would remain. For years, he anticipated they would add another top player, but over time, it became overwhelming alongside various other issues. What if Anthony Edwards is experiencing a similar situation now? What if, in 2025 or 2027, he reflects back and decides he wants out? He could be under contract, but may ask for a trade, citing insufficient support. He's been pushing hard, even scoring 50 against Detroit just to keep the team in the game. Mike Conley has aged, Julius Randle didn't contribute, Dante DiVincenzo isn't hitting shots, and the first-round pick traded for Rob Dillingham hasn't yielded results. He's frustrated with the situation and is tired of playing with unproductive teammates. He seeks a more competitive roster, and this scenario seems very plausible due to the Karl Anthony Towns trade, which, whether it proves correct later or not, was highly risky at the time. You can certainly hold Minnesota accountable for the Cat trade if you choose to, and perhaps this marks the beginning of the end for the Anthony Edwards era there, with the Cat trade being a pivotal moment for you. However, for me, this traces back to how they constructed their roster initially, giving up so much in return for Rudy Gobert. Yes, that move enhanced their defense, and pairing him with Karl Anthony Towns was a significant factor in reaching the conference finals. But it also led to the necessity of trading Karl Anthony Towns in the first place. If they hadn't acquired Gobert, who also commands a hefty salary, they could have retained Towns, developed McDaniels alongside him, and had available roster space to allocate funds more effectively. Without Gobert, it's impossible to gauge how strong their defense could have been, but I think that's where they made their mistake. While trading away Karl Anthony Towns is the most obvious connection to this season's outcomes, if they hadn't pursued the Gobert trade and allowed Towns and McDaniels to develop together, that would have likely been a wiser choice. Then, as the second apron approaches, although they may not have anticipated the CBA changes, they would have had the financial flexibility that the Towns trade took away while still keeping him on the roster. Ultimately, everything Minnesota does going forward needs to center around this reality.